The sun was just peeking over the rooftops of Pine Valley, casting long shadows across the dewy grass of a peaceful suburban neighborhood. The morning air was crisp and cool, filled with the gentle chirping of birds and the distant hum of early morning traffic. It was the kind of morning where nothing extraordinary was supposed to happen. At the corner of Maple Street, a young boy with messy brown hair and an oversized blue hoodie clutched his backpack tightly. He wasn't supposed to be cutting through yards to get to school, but the main road meant dealing with the older kids who always seemed to find a reason to pick on him. His dad didn't know about this secret route. At least, that's what he thought. As he hopped over Mrs. Wilson's perfectly trimmed hedge, his sneaker caught on a branch. He stumbled, accidentally brushing against the side of the house. Unknown to him, the slight vibration was enough to trigger an already faulty security system, sending silent alerts to the local police station. 3 blocks away, a police officer was just finishing her morning coffee in her patrol car when the call came through. Her K9 partner, a magnificent German shepherd with alert ears and intelligent eyes, sat up straight in the back seat, sensing the shift in energy. The dog's training kicked in immediately, from relaxed companion to focused protector in a split second. The patrol car rolled quietly through the neighborhood streets, the officer scanning the area while her 4-legged partner's nose worked overtime, picking up scents through the slightly opened window. The morning dew had trapped all sorts of smells close to the ground, perfect conditions for tracking. Suddenly, the dog's ears perked up, and a low whine filled the car. They were close. The officer pulled over, unclipped her partner's lead, and opened the door. The German shepherd's paws hit the pavement with practiced precision, nose already locked onto something, or someone. The boy, still unaware of the approaching situation, took his time crossing through old Mr. Parker's backyard, pausing to wave at the elderly man watering his prized roses. He'd made friends with most of the neighbors on his route over the past few months, and they'd grown used to seeing him pass through each morning. But this morning was different. The sound of panting and the click of claws on concrete made the boy's heart skip a beat. When he turned to look over his shoulder, his eyes widened at the sight of a police dog running full speed in his direction, followed by an officer calling out commands. Fear gripped his chest like an icy hand. His mind raced with confusion. He hadn't done anything wrong, had he? But the primitive part of his brain wasn't interested in reasoning. It chose flight over fight, and before he could even think it through, his legs were already moving. He ran past the swing set in the Johnsons' yard, his backpack bouncing wildly against his spine. The sound of the dog's powerful strides grew closer, accompanied by the officer's voice calling out for him to stop. But panic had taken over, pushing him to run faster than he'd ever run before. Little did anyone know, this chase would lead to one of the most unexpected and memorable moments in their quiet neighborhood's history, a moment that would bring together past and present, fear and understanding, in a way that nobody could have predicted on this otherwise ordinary morning. The chase was on, and in these early moments, nobody, not the scared boy, not the determined officer, and not even the highly trained police dog, had any idea about the surprising turn of events that was about to unfold, all because of one person's unexpected presence in the park just a few blocks away. The boy's heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. His oversized hoodie, which had felt cozy just moments ago, now seemed to weigh him down like a lead blanket. He could hear the heavy breathing of the police dog behind him, getting closer with each passing second. Neighbors who were out for their morning routines stopped in their tracks, coffee cups frozen halfway to their mouths, newspapers clutched forgotten in their hands. The sight of a young kid being chased by a police dog was definitely not part of their usual quiet morning routine. "Stop. This is the police," the officer called out, her voice echoing through the neighborhood. But to the boy, these words only added to his panic. His mind was racing faster than his feet. What had he done wrong? Was cutting through yards really such a terrible crime? He'd been doing it for months, and none of the neighbors had ever complained. The police dog, a powerful and well-trained German shepherd, was doing exactly what it had been trained to do: pursue. Its muscular legs ate up the distance between itself and the boy with each stride. The dog's focus was unwavering, driven by years of training and an innate desire to complete its mission. The boy's sneakers slapped against the pavement as he darted between houses. He knew these yards like the back of his hand. Every shortcut, every gap in the fences, every loose board he could slip through. But the dog was different from the school bullies he usually avoided. It wasn't getting tired, and it wasn't giving up. An elderly couple tending to their garden scrambled out of the way as the boy vaulted over their flower bed, accidentally scattering freshly planted petunias. "Sorry," he managed to gasp out, feeling guilty even in his panic. The police dog followed his path exactly, its powerful legs clearing the flower bed in one graceful leap. The officer was struggling to keep up with both her canine partner and the boy. She could see this was just a kid, probably no more than 12 years old, and something about the situation didn't feel right. Most burglars don't stop to apologize to gardeners, after all. But protocol was protocol, and a triggered alarm meant they had to investigate. More neighbors were emerging from their homes now, drawn by the commotion. Some had their phones out, recording the scene. Others were calling out to the boy, telling him to stop running. A few were shouting at the officer, saying they knew the kid, that he was a good boy who passed through every morning. The boy's legs were starting to feel like jelly, his lungs burning with each breath. He'd never run this far, or this fast before. Not even when running from the older kids who liked to pick on him. He could hear the dog's panting getting closer, the sound mixing with the blood rushing in his ears. He risked a glance over his shoulder and immediately regretted it. The dog was mere feet away now, its powerful jaws and alert eyes fixed firmly on him. In that split second of looking back, he stumbled slightly, his foot catching on an uneven patch of grass. He managed to stay upright, but the brief slowdown was all the dog needed to get even closer. The morning sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the lawns as the chase continued. The cool morning air that had felt so refreshing earlier now stung the boy's throat with each desperate breath. He was running out of options, running out of energy, and running out of places to go. The local park was just ahead, his last hope. Maybe there would be people there, someone who could help him, someone who could explain that he wasn't a criminal. He was just a kid trying to get to school while avoiding bullies. As he sprinted toward the park entrance, he had no idea that salvation was indeed waiting there, just not in the way he expected. The chase had become the morning's main event in the quiet suburb. The boy's legs felt like they were made of rubber, but fear kept him going. Each time he thought about stopping, the sound of the dog's powerful paws hitting the ground behind him pushed him forward. His worn-out sneakers barely had time to touch the ground as he sprinted toward the park. The police officer had called for backup, her voice crackling over the radio between heavy breaths. Young suspect, heading toward City Park. K9 in pursuit. She knew something wasn't adding up. The boy was running scared, not like someone who'd just robbed a house, but more like a frightened kid who didn't know what else to do. Neighbors were now following the chase in their cars, driving slowly alongside the action. Some were shouting out of their windows, trying to help. "He's not a bad kid," one woman called. "He helps me with my groceries every Tuesday." Another man chimed in. "That's the kid who feeds my cat when we're away." But protocol meant the officer couldn't just call off her dog based on neighbors' words. The German Shepherd was doing exactly what it was trained to do, matching the boy's every turn, every desperate sprint across streets and through yards. Its powerful muscles rippled under its fur as it bounded forward, steadily closing the gap. The dog wasn't tired. It could keep this pace for hours if needed. The boy's backpack was bouncing wildly against his spine. Textbooks and pencils probably scattered all over its insides by now. His lunch, carefully packed that morning, was probably squashed beyond recognition. These random thoughts flashed through his mind as he ran, his brain desperately trying to focus on anything except the sound of approaching paws. He jumped over a small fence, his hoodie catching for a moment on the top rail. The brief snag almost cost him his balance, but pure adrenaline kept him upright. The dog cleared the same fence with ease, barely breaking stride. The gap between them was now down to just a few feet. People in the park had started to notice the commotion. Morning joggers stopped in their tracks, parents grabbed their children from the playground equipment, and elderly couples on their morning walks hurried to move aside. The boy's presence had turned their peaceful morning routine into an impromptu spectator event. His lungs were on fire now, each breath feeling like he was inhaling sharp needles. The morning air that had felt so crisp and cool earlier now seemed thick and heavy. His vision was starting to blur around the edges, but he forced himself to keep going. The park's main path stretched out ahead of him like a runway. More police sirens could be heard in the distance, getting closer. The backup the officer had called for was on its way, but they were still minutes away. The boy knew he couldn't keep running much longer. His legs were starting to feel disconnected from his body, moving more from momentum than conscious control. He made a sharp turn onto one of the park's side paths, hoping to lose the dog in the more wooded area. But the German Shepherd was too well-trained, too focused. It matched his turn perfectly, its claws digging into the gravel path for better traction. The sound seemed to echo off the trees around them. Through the pounding in his ears and his own ragged breathing, the boy could hear the officer shouting something again. But the words were lost in the rush of blood roaring through his head. The world had narrowed down to just him, his burning legs, and the seemingly unstoppable force behind him. What he didn't know was that fate had placed someone special in the park that morning. Someone who was about to bring this whole chase to a surprising halt. As he rounded the final bend in the path, gasping for air and nearly at his limit, he was about to discover that sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places. Just as the boy felt his legs about to give out, just as the German Shepherd was close enough that he could almost feel its breath, a commanding voice cut through the morning air like a thunderclap. "Reichs, HLT." The voice was deep, authoritative, and somehow familiar to the terrified boy. The effect was instant and almost magical. The police dog, which had been seconds away from catching its target, froze mid-stride. Its ears perked up, head tilted slightly, as if unable to believe what it had just heard. The powerful animal's entire demeanor changed in a split second, from determined pursuit to alert confusion. The boy, running purely on instinct, managed another few stumbling steps before his brain registered that the sound of pursuing paws had stopped. He turned around, chest heaving, sweat dripping from his hair, to witness something extraordinary. The fierce police dog that had been chasing him was now sitting perfectly still, its attention focused on someone standing at the edge of the park path. There, dressed in running clothes and wearing a look of complete authority, stood his father. The boy's dad had always seemed impressive to him, but at this moment, he looked almost larger than life. The morning sun caught the gray in his hair, and his stance spoke of years of experience and absolute confidence. The pursuing officer jogged up, out of breath and confused. She looked from the dog to the man who had stopped it, her expression a mixture of surprise and dawning recognition. Even from a distance, you could see her eyes widening as she began to understand who was standing before her. "Sir," she called out, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty. "Are you?" She didn't even need to finish the question. The boy's father nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The dog, still sitting at attention, wagged its tail slightly at the sound of the officer's voice, but didn't move from its spot. By now, a small crowd had gathered at a safe distance. Morning joggers, curious neighbors who had followed the chase, and even a few early dog walkers stood watching the scene unfold. They whispered among themselves, trying to figure out what was happening, and who this man was who could stop a police dog with just his voice. The boy's father walked over to the German Shepherd, his movements calm and assured. The dog's tail wagged faster, and its ears relaxed. Clear signs to anyone who knew dogs that it recognized a friend. He knelt down beside the animal, scratching behind its ears as if greeting an old companion. "This is quite a coincidence," the father said, his voice carrying easily across the morning air. "I trained Rex myself 2 years ago, before I retired." He looked up at the officer, who was now standing at attention herself, having recognized the name of one of the department's most respected former K-9 trainers. The boy, still trying to catch his breath, watched in amazement as his father handled the situation. He'd known his dad used to work with police dogs, but he'd never seen him in action like this. The same dog that had been chasing him with such intensity was now acting like an oversized puppy, leaning into his father's touch. More police cars were arriving at the park's entrance, their lights flashing in the morning sun. Officers stepped out, ready to help with what they thought was a pursuit in progress, only to stop and stare at the scene before them. Many of them recognized the boy's father. He had trained either them or their dogs over his long career. The morning breeze carried the sound of confused murmurs from the growing crowd. The boy looked around, seeing phones recording the scene, people pointing, and expressions of disbelief on every face. His own breathing was finally starting to slow, his heart no longer feeling like it might burst from his chest. As he watched his father calm both the dog and the situation, he realized this story would be told in their neighborhood for years to come. The morning that had started with chaos was now settling into something entirely different. The father stood up from petting Rex, the German shepherd still sitting obediently at his feet. The gathered crowd watched in fascination as he turned to address the young officer who had been pursuing his son. "I know this might seem strange," he said with a gentle smile, "but that boy you were chasing is my son." The officer's face flushed red with embarrassment as the pieces started falling into place. She looked from father to son, noting the similar features she hadn't noticed in the heat of the chase. Rex, the police dog, kept glancing between his current handler and his former trainer, as if trying to make sense of the situation himself. His tail wagged whenever the father looked his way, showing the strong bond that remained even after years apart. The officer noticed this and couldn't help but smile despite her embarrassment. The morning joggers and neighbors who had gathered were now moving closer, feeling the tension dissolve. Some were even laughing quietly, especially those who had been shouting about knowing the boy during the chase. One elderly lady stepped forward, still clutching her gardening gloves. "I tried to tell you," she said to the officer, though there was no anger in her voice. "He passes through my yard every morning. Always says hello, sometimes even helps me with my roses." Other neighbors nodded in agreement, adding their own stories about the helpful young boy they'd come to know. The father placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder, who was still catching his breath and looking somewhat sheepish. "Though I do think we need to talk about why you've been cutting through yards instead of taking the regular route to school," he said, giving his son a knowing look that suggested he already understood the reason. The officer, professional despite her embarrassment, explained about the triggered alarm that had started the whole incident. As she spoke, more details emerged. The sensor had been faulty, setting off false alarms for weeks. The home's owners had been meaning to get it fixed, but hadn't gotten around to it. Rex had moved to sit between father and son, seemingly happy to be close to both. The father reached down absent-mindedly to scratch the dog's ears as he listened to the officer's explanation. "He's grown into a fine police dog," he commented, pride evident in his voice. "Just as focused and determined as when I trained him." More officers who had arrived as backup were now gathering around, many of them former trainees of the father. They shared quiet laughs and head shakes at the coincidence of it all. Some even pulled out their phones to take pictures. It wasn't every day you saw a retired K-9 trainer reunited with one of his former students. The boy, having finally caught his breath, found his voice. "Dad, I didn't know Rex was your dog," he said, looking at the German shepherd with new appreciation. The father chuckled. "One of many I trained before retiring. But he was always special, had the strongest determination I'd ever seen in a police dog." The morning sun was now fully up, casting a warm glow over the scene. Parents who had grabbed their children from the playground were allowing them to return, seeing that the excitement was over. Some of the kids were pointing at Rex, amazed to see a police dog sitting so calmly after such an intense chase. The officer's radio crackled with questions from dispatch, wanting to know the status of the pursuit. She picked it up, glancing at father and son with a smile. "Situation resolved," she reported. "False alarm. And you won't believe who we ran into at the park." The father could hear laughter coming through the radio. Clearly, word of his involvement was already spreading through the department. As the morning excitement began to settle, everyone gathered in a loose circle near the park bench. The father, still occasionally patting Rex's head, began explaining the full story to the officers and curious neighbors who remained. His voice carried the warmth of someone who had spent years teaching others. "My son takes this shortcut every morning," he began, glancing at his boy with understanding eyes. The young officer leaned forward, clipboard in hand, eager to document how a simple morning had turned into such an unexpected situation. The father continued, "He's been avoiding the main street because of some trouble with older kids." The boy stared at his shoes, scuffing them against the ground. He hadn't known his father knew about the bullies. Several neighbors nodded. They'd seen the older kids who hung around the main street, sometimes making trouble for younger students walking to school. "The alarm system at the Peterson house has been acting up for weeks," added a neighbor who lived next door to the triggered alarm. "Every time the wind blows too hard, that thing goes off. We've been telling them to get it fixed." The officer made notes, realizing how a series of small events had snowballed into this morning's chase. Rex had settled down completely, lying at the father's feet as if he'd never left his training days. Other officers were sharing stories about the father's time as a canine trainer. "Remember when you helped train my first police dog?" One veteran officer asked. "That dog could find anything you hid, no matter how clever you thought you were." The boy's eyes widened as he listened to stories about his father's career. He knew his dad had worked with police dogs, but he'd never really understood the impact his father had made on the department. Each officer seemed to have a story about how the father had helped them or trained their dog. The young officer who'd been chasing the boy looked embarrassed again. "I should have realized something was off," she said. "The neighbors were all trying to tell me he wasn't a burglar." The father smiled kindly. "You were doing your job," he assured her. "Rex was doing exactly what he was trained to do, what I trained him to do." Parents walking their kids to school stopped to watch the unusual gathering. The sight of a police dog lying peacefully among a group of chatting people was quite different from the dramatic chase they'd heard about just minutes earlier. Some kids waved at Rex, who wagged his tail but stayed dutifully in place. The morning sun had risen higher, reminding everyone that the day was moving on. The boy suddenly remembered he was supposed to be in school. "Dad," he started, looking worried about being late, but his father was already nodding. "Don't worry," he said. "We'll explain everything to your teacher." One of the officers suggested taking a photo to document the unusual reunion. Everyone gathered around, with Rex sitting proudly between father and son. The young officer who'd been handling Rex joined them, still amazed at how the morning had unfolded. The father put one hand on his son's shoulder and the other on Rex's head, creating a picture that would surely become a department favorite. As people began dispersing, returning to their morning routines, the father kept his hand on his son's shoulder. "Tomorrow," he said gently, "let's talk about finding a better way to get to school. One that doesn't involve hopping fences or triggering alarms." The boy nodded, realizing that sometimes the long way around might be better than a shortcut. The faulty alarm that had started it all was still beeping faintly in the distance, a reminder of how small things can lead to unexpected moments. As the officers prepared to leave, Rex gave one last look at his former trainer, his tail wagging slightly as if saying goodbye to an old friend. The father smiled, knowing that sometimes life's most interesting stories come from moments of confusion turned into understanding. The exciting morning had sparked something unexpected in the community. As the father stood in front of a small crowd at the park, he sought an opportunity to turn this incident into something positive. People had gathered around, eager to learn more about police dogs and their training. A police dog isn't just about chasing people, the father explained, as Rex sat attentively beside him. "They're incredibly smart animals who help keep our community safe." Children who had been scared of the dog earlier were now watching with fascination as the father demonstrated basic commands. The young officer who had been handling Rex stood nearby, adding her own insights about working with police dogs. She'd gotten over her initial embarrassment and was now eager to learn from someone with so much experience. "Every day with these dogs is a learning experience," she said, smiling as Rex responded perfectly to each command. Parents in the crowd started asking questions about what to do if they ever encountered a police dog. The father's eyes lit up. This was what he had done for years, teaching people to understand these amazing animals. "The worst thing you can do is run," he explained, giving his son a gentle pat on the shoulder. "Just like we learned today." A few kids raised their hands, wanting to know if they could pet Rex. The father looked at the young officer, who nodded her approval. "Let's show them the right way to approach a police dog," he suggested. One by one, he showed the children how to safely greet Rex, explaining the importance of being calm and gentle. The boy watched his father in action, seeing a side of him he'd never fully appreciated before. Other officers who had stayed joined in, sharing their own experiences working with police dogs. Stories of successful searches, rescued people, and lives saved had everyone hanging on every word. Some of the neighbors who had witnessed the morning's chase brought up concerns about the older kids who had been bullying younger students. The officers listened carefully, taking notes and suggesting ways to make the route to school safer for everyone. The father's knowledge of both law enforcement and children's safety proved invaluable in this discussion. Rex seemed to enjoy being the center of attention, showing off his training with perfect obedience. When the father demonstrated how police dogs are trained to find hidden objects, the crowd gasped in amazement as Rex located a small toy that had been carefully hidden in the park. "These dogs are partners, not just tools," the father explained as Rex proudly returned with his find. "They form incredible bonds with their handlers and would do anything to protect them and their community." The young officer nodded in agreement, her hand resting proudly on Rex's back. Someone from the local community center, who had been watching the impromptu demonstration, approached the father with an idea. "Would you consider doing a presentation for our youth group?" they asked. "Kids need to understand that police dogs aren't something to fear." The father's face lit up at the suggestion. Other parents joined in, asking if this could become a regular thing. The father looked at his son, who was now helping demonstrate how to properly approach a police dog to some younger children. The morning's frightening chase had transformed into an unexpected opportunity to bring the community together. The boy, who earlier had been running in terror from Rex, was now explaining to his peers what he had learned. "I thought running was the only option," he admitted to the other kids. "But sometimes facing your fears helps you discover something amazing." His father beamed with pride, seeing how his son had turned a scary experience into a teaching moment. The next few days brought big changes to both the police station and the community. The father and son's story had spread quickly, touching hearts and sparking curiosity throughout the neighborhood. When they arrived at the police station for a special visit, they were greeted like celebrities. Officers gathered around, eager to hear the retired trainer share his wisdom. The son watched in amazement as his father moved through the station, greeting old colleagues and meeting new faces. Every few steps, someone would stop them to share a memory or ask for advice. "Your dad was the best trainer we ever had," one veteran officer told the boy. "The dogs he trained have saved countless lives." In the canine training area behind the station, several police dogs and their handlers had gathered for an impromptu training session. The father's eyes sparkled as he watched the current generation of dogs and handlers working together. Rex was there too, showing off his skills with his young handler. "Watch how they communicate," the father explained to a group of new handlers. "It's not just about commands, it's about trust and understanding." The son sat nearby, taking in every word. He'd never paid much attention to his father's old stories about dog training before, but now they held new meaning. One of the newer officers brought out a young German Shepherd puppy, just starting its training. "Would you mind taking a look?" she asked the father. "Something's not clicking with the basic commands." The father knelt down, and within minutes he had spotted the issue. His gentle guidance had the puppy responding perfectly. The son found himself surrounded by friendly officers who wanted to hear his side of the chase story. "I bet you were scared," one officer said kindly. "But look at you now, helping others understand these amazing dogs." The boy nodded, realizing how much had changed in just a few days. Throughout the morning, more handlers arrived with their dogs, having heard that the legendary trainer was back for a visit. The training area became a hub of activity, with dogs and handlers practicing various skills. The father moved from pair to pair, offering tips and encouragement, just like old times. Rex seemed especially proud, showing the younger dogs how things were done. The young officer handling him explained how the chase had actually improved their partnership. "Now I understand even better how smart and capable these dogs are," she said, patting Rex's head affectionately. During a break, one of the senior officers approached with an interesting proposal. "We've been thinking," he said, "would you consider coming back as a guest instructor? Maybe once a month." The father looked surprised but pleased. His son immediately piped up, "Dad, you have to do it." The station's community outreach coordinator joined the conversation, sharing how many calls they'd received from schools and youth groups wanting to learn about police dogs. "Your story has created quite a buzz," she explained. "People want to understand these dogs better, especially the kids." The father looked around at the eager faces of both humans and dogs. He saw how his years of experience could still make a difference. But more importantly, he saw how this unexpected event had opened new doors for his son too. The boy who had once been terrified of a police dog was now helping younger kids overcome their own fears. As they prepared to leave the station that afternoon, officers and their dogs lined up to say goodbye. Rex gave both father and son a friendly nudge with his nose. The young officer handling him smiled. "You know, sometimes the scariest moments in our lives lead us to the best opportunities." The father couldn't help but agree as he watched his son confidently petting the police dogs goodbye. 6 months had passed since that unforgettable morning chase, and the changes in the community were remarkable. The local park, once just a simple gathering place, had become the regular spot for the father's monthly Understanding Canines program. Today, the usual crowd of excited kids and interested parents had gathered, eager for another session. The boy, who had once run in terror from a police dog, now stood confidently beside his father, helping to introduce young children to the gentle side of these working animals. He wore a special Junior Police Program t-shirt, a badge of honor that reminded everyone of how a scary moment had transformed into something wonderful. "Remember to approach slowly," he told a nervous little girl as Rex sat patiently nearby. "These dogs might look tough, but they're actually really friendly when they're not working." The young officer who had chased him that morning months ago stood watching, pride evident in her smile. She and Rex had become regular visitors to these community events. The father's voluntary training sessions at the police department had become legendary. Officers from neighboring districts would drive for hours just to attend. "It's not just about the dogs," one officer explained to a local reporter covering the program. "He teaches us how to connect with the community too. Every chase doesn't have to end in fear." The school route that had once been troubled by bullies had transformed as well. Regular police patrols, including friendly visits from K-9 units, had made the area safer for all students. The older kids who used to cause trouble had even become interested in the police dog program, their energy redirected towards something positive. Parents would often stop the father and son on the street to share how their children's fear of dogs had disappeared after attending the park sessions. "My daughter used to cry whenever she saw a police car with a dog," one mother said. "Now she wants to be a K-9 officer when she grows up." The young officer and Rex had grown into one of the department's most effective teams. She often credited that morning's chase with teaching her the importance of reading situations more carefully. "Sometimes what looks like a problem is actually an opportunity," she would say during community presentations. You just have to be willing to stop and listen. The father's reputation as a trainer had only grown stronger. His methods, focusing on understanding and connection rather than just obedience, were being adopted by other departments. It's not about teaching dogs to chase people, he would explain. It's about teaching them to help people, to make our community safer. The boy had started a junior police club at his school, with his father and various canine units making regular visits. Students who had once been scared of police dogs now eagerly attended every meeting. Even the principal noticed a change in school spirit as students learned about responsibility and community service through the program. Local businesses had gotten involved too. The pet store donated supplies for demonstrations. The ice cream shop offered free cones to kids who completed the junior police program, and the community center had dedicated space for weekly training sessions during bad weather. The story of the chase had become something of a local legend, retold at community events with increasing amounts of laughter. Remember when you thought you were in big trouble? The father would tease his son during presentations. Now look at you, teaching others about the very thing that scared you. As another successful park session wrapped up, the father, son, and young officers stood watching the happy families leave. Rex lay contentedly at their feet, occasionally accepting gentle pats from passing children. The setting sun cast long shadows across the park, much like it had on that eventful morning months ago. Who would have thought, the young officer mused, that a simple chase could change so many lives? The father smiled, putting an arm around his son's shoulders. Sometimes the best endings come from the scariest beginnings, he said. We just have to be brave enough to stick around and see what happens next.